Charisma on the battlefield is different. Charisma on the battlefield is showing your commitment. Charisma on the battlefield is showing your courage. It's showing your competence. It's showing your perseverance in some cases. And so suddenly, soldiers don't care if you're 6'2" with straight teeth and, good posture. What they care is, are you that kind of person that they think, holy smoke, this person really is good at what they do, cares about the soldiers. And so it's a different kind of charisma. When I think of Elon Musk sleeping on factory floors when he's trying to push a certain process through, there's a charisma to that. Holy smoke, because we're attracted to that. Holy smoke, here's a person who's so all in, we're going to do that.
So that is former 4-star General Stanley McChrystal, or as he prefers to be called these days, simply Stan. Look, I don't like to do these long 3-4 hour podcast interviews a la Joe Rogan. Frankly, I don't have time for them anyway, but I could have easily spent that much time with Stan and not run out of things to talk about. I found him to be insightful, thoughtful, and introspective, and most importantly, well-grounded and down-to-earth. Absolutely zero pretense for this guy. So stay with me for this one as we touch upon character and culture and leadership and a range of other topics. I really admire Stan, and I think you will too when you're done listening to this one. Okay? All right, so here we go. My guest today is General Stanley McChrystal, who is a retired 4-star general and former commander of U.S. and international forces in Afghanistan at the Joint Special Operations Command, where he led the nation's most elite counterterrorism efforts. With 34 years of military service, he is recognized for reshaping modern warfare and pioneering team-based leadership approaches in high-stakes environments. Today, he is the founder and CEO of the McChrystal Group, a leadership advisory firm that helps organizations adapt and thrive in complex, fast-changing environments. He is the author of multiple best-selling books, his most recent one being On Character, The Choices That Define Us, where he explores how leaders are remembered not just for what they achieve, but who they are. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show where I interview world-class leaders and trailblazers to discover the ingredients of outsized performance. I'm Glenn Zweig, a leadership advisor and executive coach, and I'm here to help each of you unlock your own potential. That is, your own version of excellence. Stan, sir, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Glenn. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it. And just for the record, I asked you what to call you, and you gave me permission for Stan. I don't want people giving me flack and say, hey, it's once a general, always a general. So
no, I didn't give you just permission. I asked you to call me Stan because that's
okay.
What I prefer.
That's an order, and I follow orders. Okay, it's a real pleasure to have you on. I've been looking forward to this for some time. And I'll tell you where I want to kick off. Your morning routine. And I read that you wake up every morning at 4 a.m. And I will say that my wife thinks I'm crazy because I get up at 4:30 a.m. So we're at least both in the sub 5 a.m. club. But I would love to hear more about that, other morning rituals. I think I heard you generally don't eat until dinner time. Would love to understand some of that and what's behind it.
Sure, Glenn. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm pretty much a creature of routine, and I try to retain or maintain the routine even when I'm traveling. And I get up early, and I, shave and do all the prep. And I put all this on my Outlook calendar. I'm fanatical about detail on my calendar. And so I get ready, and then I go do physical training. And my regime is an hour and a half in the morning. On day one, I'll call it, I do cardio, which is I do 70 minutes on an elliptical trainer that I have. I built a little home gym. And then I do 20 minutes on a stationary bike. I used to love to run, but I had my back fused 5 years ago, and so that's not realistic now. Then on the other day, the alternate day, I do a weightlifting and abdominal routine that also takes an hour and a half. You know, and it, again, up in my little gym. When I finish that, I come back, I get cleaned up, you know.
No, hang on. Just to back up for a second. So this is at 4 a.m.?
Well, the whole process starts then.
Why? Why does the process start at 4 a.m.?
Well, because you control that time. Because the reality is, once your day starts, if you're a busy person, there are people who can interrupt you and will interrupt you. There are meetings scheduled, there are requirements that come in, there are calls from different time zones, there are all these things. So I found that early in the morning is the time when I can block that and have a high confidence. There aren't going to be a lot of people who try to involve themselves in that time. The second thing is I very much like to get the hardest part of my day done early. So working out is hard. I mean, I value working out, but I'm not going to lie. I tell you, I'd love to not work out. I'd love to lie in bed and watch TV. But I found that after I work out, I feel so much better physically and better about myself that it's better for me, even when I desperately don't want to get up, I force myself to get up and go. Now, if my wife and I are traveling early, because she travels with me most of the time, let's say we have a very early flight, I'll get up at 2 to do that workout so that I can then get cleaned up and go to the airport. Because I've learned that later in the day, I will be so much happier if I've gone on and gotten it done. And so I make the hardest thing first.
Now, can I ask you just to pause there for a second?
Yeah.
Before we go on. So I think there was a book, I think it was Admiral McCraven. I don't know if you know each other, but I think he said something to the effect of that you should make your bed every morning. And my understanding, I didn't have him on the podcast yet, but my understanding from that is that the discipline of doing that, even though it's not the hardest thing you're doing in the day, in fact, it's probably the easiest thing, but just the fact that you're accomplishing something, some task, first thing, gives you a sense of pride, momentum that cascades into bigger, more meaningful things throughout the day. Is there anything of that you subscribe to, or completely different approach, different philosophy?
No, I subscribe to all of it. Bill and I are close friends, and we served together for many years. And his point is exactly right. It's not just a feeling of accomplishment. It's a feeling that you have a standard. My standard is when I get out of bed, I make it. Now, the military required that, but when you get out, if you have standards, are you going to maintain a certain level of health? Are you going to do certain things? Once you set those standards for yourself and create expectations that you won't violate them, they become very powerful. They're good habits, I'd call them.
Okay, interesting. All right, so back to the routine. So you've got you're rotating on and off the cardio and the weights and this sort of thing, and then what?
And then, like most people, you know, I talk with my wife a little bit and that sort of thing. Sometimes I have time to go see my granddaughters. They live next door to me a little bit before work. But then I go to work, and I try to be at work, and pretty, 8 o'clock, something like that, 8:15, because I live 3 blocks from my office, so it makes it easy. And then I go through a work day. Now, as you mentioned, I don't eat until dinner. And people say that's some kind of Zen thing. It's not. When I was a young lieutenant about 40-some years ago, I thought I was getting fat, and I don't have the discipline to eat little meals. So what I do is I do have the discipline to eat nothing. And then I get to dinner, and I can reward myself at dinner. I can eat whatever I want, and as much as I want, because, you've got that rhythm. So I've maintained that now for 40 plus years, and it works for me. I don't say it's perfect for everyone, but
yeah. You were doing intermittent fasting, if you will, before intermittent fasting became a thing, right? A trend out there. And given the discipline that obviously you've had throughout your career, you have to this day, I was a little bit shocked to hear that you're almost expelled from West Point.
Yeah.
And because you've got to be so, I imagine, so driven and disciplined and focused to even get into that institution. So could you share that story? What happened?
Yeah. I'm more disciplined now than I was at 17, 18 years old. But at the same time, I'm not completely disciplined. And so I'd like to tell you everything in my life is perfect discipline. It's not. In that case, and I'll give you the back sort of so what as well. I went to West Point at age 17, graduated from high school, went straight into West Point summer of 1972. And for the first 2 years, I had terrible study habits. I had done pretty well in high school, but I never studied very hard because you just didn't have to. I could coast through. But when I got to West Point, the way they taught, and they were into calculus and sciences, mathematically based sciences, and that's not my strong point. And so for 2 years academically, I really struggled. I didn't fail, but I struggled. I also had discipline problems, and that was, I'm going to call it immaturity. I got a series of big punishments called slugs at West Point, and they are disciplinary actions. You are caught doing something, you transgress, and they have a board, and a board like a trial. It's really not much of a trial. They just basically bring you in and say what your punishment is going to be. But I got a series of those, and on the last one, my fourth, it was the spring of my sophomore year. And based upon how the officer in charge who had caught us wrote it up, if he had written it more seriously, I'd have been thrown out because I would have gone through the threshold on demerits for the year. Instead, he chose to write it in a way, it was his choice of language, and I think he knew what he was doing. And he wrote it so that it kept me under the demerit threshold. So I skated right under that. And so my first 2 years, I was that close to getting thrown out for discipline.
Well, there's the academics, and it sounds like maybe there was something else, some shenanigans or something you were involved with that got you some of this. What was there some kind of rebellious streak that you had at school?
Yeah, I don't know what I was rebelling against. West Point was pretty strict at the time, and I wasn't interested in that, and so I was violating it. I wouldn't give it the dignity of saying I was rebellious. I would just say that I was ill-disciplined and immature. You know, a couple of the times I got caught drinking alcohol when I shouldn't have been. And they didn't catch me drinking alcohol, they caught me drunk, dead drunk. And so that was a bad thing. And then there were a couple others that were not good.
Right.
But I think it was me just ignoring the seriousness of what they were trying to do. And the thing that's funny is I went to West Point, and this is what I sometimes explain to people. I went to West Point to be an Army officer. Some people went to West Point to be a West Point cadet, that was sort of the apogee of their goal. It was to go to West Point. I didn't view West Point that at all. I viewed it as just a throughput, a turnstile on the turnpike.
It was a means to an end.
Yeah, and I would be like my father. But what I did was I put all of that ultimate goal at risk with really immature actions that could have gotten me thrown out. You know, I've gone back to West Point since then, and I've given some speeches to cadets. And it's always funny because I can tell them my academics weren't good, and I almost got thrown out for discipline, and yet I ended up a 4-star general. And so I can kind of poke fun at the place.
Yeah.
It's a funny story because I ended up in the military and it was successful. If I'd been thrown out and I was doing something that I never wanted to do, it wouldn't be such a funny story.
Well, let me ask you.
I remind myself that now.
So you mentioned your father, who was in the military. His father was in the military. Your brothers all served, as I understand. So I guess I'm wondering, did you feel compelled to serve? Almost like it was, like it or not, this is almost like your family duty to embark on a military career before maybe at that age, 17, you really, really, truly knew what you wanted in your life?
Yeah, it's a fair point, but I never felt that way.
Okay.
At about age 3 or 4, as young as I was able to answer, I would have told you I wanted to be a soldier because I wanted to be my father. He was my hero. And that never changed. And so when I went in the military, it wasn't with any resistance, with any hesitation. It was right near the end of the Vietnam War, so the military wasn't popular. But I so wanted to be him that I never applied to any other colleges. I just sort of single-threaded. And fortunately, it turned out I liked it.
Well, then you end up going to the Rangers after you graduated. I don't know if that was immediate or pretty soon thereafter. So it's almost going from one extreme to another, because that's got to be one of the most intense, highly structured, highly disciplined units you could possibly join. Anything that's special forces. So why did you go that route?
Well, I didn't go straight to the Rangers. I went to the 82nd Airborne Division, and I was a paratrooper, and that was good, but it was the 1970s, and that organization was
paratroopers,
struggling.
are those the PJs?
No. The paratroopers are, if you think the movie The Longest Day or one of those old, that's the paratroopers.
Okay.
You know, you jump in big numbers, and it was great, but it was the 1970s, and the Army was recovering from Vietnam, so it wasn't really good.
Okay.
Then I went into Special Forces, a Green Beret, and I enjoyed that. Then I went to Korea for a year, and then I went to a mechanized infantry unit. But all of those times, I had developed a desire to go to the Rangers. The Rangers were hard to get in. You had to get accepted. Things had to work out right to get into the Rangers elite unit. So it took me a number of years before the stars aligned. But during those years, I increasingly knew I wanted to go there because, as you described, the Rangers were sort of the ultimate in a very disciplined force. I mean, hyper-disciplined. Everything about the Rangers was based on standards, and they were picayune about adherence to those standards. I mean, you had to have a fresh haircut Monday morning, meaning you had to get it cut on Sunday, and it had to be completely shaved on the side, and this little, we called it a birth control haircut. And the way your equipment was, the way you interacted with people was very different from the rest of the Army, because the Rangers had decided that they were going to be an organization founded on extraordinary level of performance based on standards.
There was something I was going to get to later when we talk about leadership, but now that we're on it, let me talk about it now, which is, you mentioned how, and by the way, I read several books and lots of things. I don't know which was pulling from which, but there was somewhere where you talked about how, while the Rangers were for sure an elite force, they weren't elite individuals per se.
Right.
And your words here, they were, quote, average talent connected by willingness to adhere to standards exceeding what others would accept. So I know you've spoken a lot about culture and healthy cultures, and this is really interesting, even somewhat provocative, because I would have thought anyone in Special Forces is some kind of elite when I think of SEALs, and you mentioned Green Berets, Rangers, all of these. So love to hear more about that philosophy.
Yeah, Glenn, you've hit an incredibly important point, because from the outside, we look at elite units and we assume that they are stronger, smarter, braver, you name it, better people. And they have a selection and assessment process for the SEALs, for Delta Force, for the Rangers, all of them have one. But they don't really test for that. As a SEAL, to pass the course, you don't really need to swim all that well. That's kind of surprising. For any of the others, your performance doesn't have to be of any high athletic level. The thing that they're looking for is a willingness to continue, persevere, not quit. And that's it's popular to call it grit now. And you say, well, wow, if we're not getting the best and brightest, we're settling for average people, but average people who will commit themselves to higher standards. And so my experience in the Rangers, I got there and I expected, because I hadn't really thought about it much then, I expected everybody to be, larger than life. And they were absolutely normal, but they had all signed on to this higher level of performance and standards, some of which were inconvenient and painful, because we used to laugh that being in the Rangers, the only thing worse was not being in the Rangers. And so it is, when we talk about culture, I've become a huge believer that these CEOs that say, I only want A talent, I don't want B and C talent. And I get their point, but I would disagree on the talent part, because I think a big component of the talent is a person's desire, their drive, their willingness to see things through. And that's sometimes a rarer commodity than just brains.
Yeah, I've had a couple SEALs on the show, and as they're going through training, especially Bud's training and Hell Week, and then, hey, anytime you want out, just go ahead and ring the bell, and you're out. And sure enough, one by one, they all keep dropping like flies, just because of the tour. You're right; it's much more of a mental game, if you will, than it, because it's beyond the physical limits anyone should be ever enduring. And just how much the desire to push through and fight through, whether grit's the right word or whatever the right word is there. Just to shift gears, Stan, this book you just wrote on character, by the way, read it, loved it. It's not a memoir. I mean, although you weave in some stories there, I mean, it's a book on character. Why did you write a book on character?
Yeah, I hit this point in my life, and I found that that's what I think about most. Earlier in life, you think about what you're learning in education or what you're training in, maybe your family or your success in your business, and you're pursuing a number of things, and character's in the backdrop. But I don't know that I put it forward in the front part of my mind. And now at my age, I realize that was always the most important thing. That was always the key aspect of whether someone was worthy or not, and performance. And so I also have enough experience now to think about it more deeply than I did before. Like everybody, I read a certain amount of philosophy, less than I should have, but at this point in my life, I've got a lot of experiences that I can put against sort of written philosophy, and I can start to say, okay, what do I think about that? And the fascinating part of this book was I started writing these, I call them reflections. They're essays on separate topics, but they all intersect on character. And as I wrote each one, if you and I had been doing this podcast before I wrote the book and you'd asked me a question on any one of them, I would have probably confidently given you a very quick, concise answer. But when I had to write them, I found that I had to make an argument with myself that would convince me. And I found that in many cases, my thoughts on those issues were much more nuanced than I had realized. And in some cases, more nuanced than I'd even used in my life. And I began to understand that we need to consider character, not take it for granted. Not saying I have good character, bad character, but constantly explore it and say, what does that actually mean? How does that affect what I do?
Yeah. Well, on that note, could you define it for me in your version of a character?
Sure.
What does it mean? Yeah.
Yeah. The way I have done is I've said that it is a mathematical formula, and it's made up of two parts. The first part is your convictions. And when I describe convictions, I say that they're the strongly held beliefs that we have, not things that we have just gotten from somebody else and we accept as real, but things we've pressure tested, and the things that we're willing to live to, or if necessary, die for. And then the other part of the equation, it's the product, is our discipline to live to them. And I make that distinction because you can have the best values and convictions in the world, but if you lack the discipline, and courage is part of that discipline, to actually let them guide you, then it equals zero, because anything times zero is zero. And I think that we've got a lot of people who could make the case that they've got these wonderful convictions, but then if we watch the conduct of their lives, it doesn't reflect that at all. And so I would say your actual character is the product.
Was character something that they try to indoctrinate into you in the military, or is it one of those things where either you have it or you don't?
No, they spent a lot of effort in trying to teach it to us, build it in us. And I think it's all learned. I think you learn part of it from your parents. I think you learn part of it from other experiences. I think you can learn it through being exposed to good ideas. At West Point, the ones I remember most were duty, honor, and country. And I adopted them when I went there because I thought I should. But it probably took me decades before I really was able to dial in what they actually mean to me. You know, what does honor actually mean? What am I prepared to do and not do? How does that govern my behavior and my judgment of others? And it's much more, it's a deeper issue than just a word in duty, honor, country. And the military tries to give you experiences combined with training that help you shape your character. But the reality is, like any organization, you have a spectrum of characters. People have different levels. And we're sometimes reluctant to talk about it or pressure it. We're reluctant to say, Stan, your character is not good enough. It's, you know, it's getting so personal about someone. And yet, to me, it is the most important metric of a person. Because I can, if someone lacks some talent or they lack other skills, I can live with that, we can work with that, I can account for that. But if their character is weak enough to be undependable, then I think it's a foundation you can't build anything on. You just don't know whether that person will be there when you need them.
I think you delineate between personal and public character. We'd love to know the difference between the two and maybe what happens when those diverge.
Yeah, I think there are two. So individual character first, and because there are two ways to parse that. I think a lot of people believe that they have an individual character and then they have a public character, and that one is related to their position or their role. I find it difficult really to separate those, because there are people who we've known in history that have pretty disappointing character in their personal lives. They do some things that are pretty sad. And then on their public service lives, they may actually do things that are very good. Someone once described Bill Clinton as having, on a macro level, great character; on a micro level, not much character. But he's an example because we happen to know of someone who's had shortcomings that way, and we all have some. So I think that there is that difference, but I don't think, I have a difficult time believing that someone who lies in their personal lives, whether it's to their spouse or on other things, won't lie to me in their public life. I can't accept the premise that they are suddenly honorable and trustworthy in their public life if in fact in their personal life they are not, because I think that's too stark a difference. And I think the habit of not having integrity pulls through. Now, you may be able to shine it up at the national or at the public level and have guard rails around you that force you to limit you, but there's still a weakness there, a pretty significant weakness. I wrote an op-ed not long ago on Father's Day, and what I said was, if someone ever describes to me someone as a great father, but we know on the other side of their lives they're, you know, a Vito Corleone, you know, they murder people and they're a crime boss, but they're a great father, I don't buy that. And the reason I don't buy that is because children watch parents holistically. And so if a parent is a doting parent, goes to baseball games, gives great birthday parties, but they lie, cheat, and steal in their business or personal lives, their kids see that. And their kids, in some way, are impacted by that. They may or may not emulate that behavior, but there's a good chance that they will. And so someone says, well, he's a bad person, but he's a great father. I go, no. He is a bad person who does some good father behaviors, and you can't pretend that one is different from the other.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're just on the heels of this infamous Coldplay concert, of course, that we've all seen, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I did see a post though, and I didn't have a chance to digest the post or fact checked it, but the essence of it was that when there's dishonesty in one's personal life, that generally speaking, that's not isolated, to your point, that shined a light on a little bit about that person's character. And there is a correlation between dishonesty in one's private life and dishonesty in a workplace environment. And so I thought that was sort of interesting. Was there, to put the mirror on yourself, Stan, any example, a moment in your life, in your career, when your character was actively tested?
Oh yeah, I mean, we all of us have that.
Yeah.
And there were a number of times when my character was tested and I failed. And I'm not going to bear them all here, but the reality is, I made as many mistakes or maybe more than the average person. And when I made a mistake that was stupid, bad judgment or something, that's all right. But when I knew that what I had done wasn't the character that I wanted to have, then it should cause, and in my case, I think it did cause soul searching. And you're always going to have those, if I talk about micro ones, cases where I treat somebody unfairly or rudely, and I still find myself doing it. I'm tired, I'm irritated, you name it, and I react or treat someone in a way that they don't deserve to be treated. And that's not a big thing, but it is a big thing. And when those happen, I'm disappointed in myself. And you feel a bit of self-loathing for a while, and yet you also, what I do is I say, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. But of course, it does happen again. Hopefully it happens less often than I would like it to. I use some forcing functions now as you get older, as you start to realize that what you reap, or that's what you sow, you reap. That's not apparent when you're young. But as you get older, it is apparent, particularly in a world where everything's captured now and remembered and recorded. I am thoughtful that what my granddaughters, I have 3 granddaughters, what they know of me, I want it to be as good as it can be. Not perfect, because I know I'm not perfect. They've seen me way too much to pretend that I am. But I want them to believe that I'm someone that they could believe in. And I think we all need some kind of a metric that we use that says, okay, how good a person do we want to be? We're not all going to be, none of us are going to be perfect. But how good should we be? And the answer is something I don't think we think that much about. And then if you said, Stan, are you a good person? And I said, well, I think I am. You'd say, well, tell me, what do you do that makes you a good person? And that's when you start to tug on threads on yourself that says, okay, what do I do that's good? I may do things effectively. I may be successful in my business and my work and whatever. I may be talented. But what do I do that's good? What makes me judge myself as good? And then the question is, can you be good by just not being bad? And that's something each of us has to explore for ourselves. And I'm of the belief that you can't. But that's my conclusion. And I think everybody needs to reach a conclusion of how good that they want to be. What's the standard that they want to live to?
So I want to try to tie this a little bit to your former life as a 4-star general. And this isn't, this is really anyone that's in a position of leadership in the military, but you're here on the podcast, so I'll ask you, when you're at that level, how do you handle a situation if the situation were to arise where perhaps you disagree with the administration on the use of military force in a particular situation? And I mean, look, you're in the military, so I assume there's a part of it which is, hey, ultimately you've got to follow orders, and that's your duty. That's what you signed up for. But it's got to be, I would think, challenging if it maybe goes against some of your core values and beliefs. I mean, you're putting people, your own people, in harm's way. You're obviously, causing a lot of harm and disruption, death, et cetera. On the other side, how is that something that happens, and how does one deal with that situation?
Yeah, it happens all the time, and in various shades. But for example, I disagreed with the invasion of Iraq in the spring of 2003. I had come out of Afghanistan. I was on the Joint Staff, and I disagreed with us going into Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein. I didn't think it was illegal. I just thought it was unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And so in that case, the way I processed it and the way I still would today, I think we give our best military advice, and then when our civilian masters make a decision, we execute. Because what they've told us to do is not morally wrong, and it's not illegal, and therefore I should do it because I signed up to do all the legal, lawful things that I'm directed to do. And you can't have a military that only follows the orders they agree with. Now, had they given orders, and they didn't, but had they given orders to conduct operations that I thought were illegal, like against civilians or immoral, had we gotten directions to do that, then it's different. Then, of course, I have a moral and a legal requirement to not execute that order, to in fact push back and say no. Okay, so what if that's easy? It's binary, those two cases. Mm-hmm. What if it's kind of in the middle? What if you are involved in operations where maybe you're not directed to do things that are illegal or immoral, but the entire outcome and the conduct of those operations is something that you think is bad? Mm-hmm. How do you deal with it? Then I think it has to get very personal. I think first you owe your leaders the feedback that says, I got real issues with this, whatever it is. If you can't fix those issues, then you have to make the decision when you step away, when you quit, leave the force, say, I can't support what we're doing, or maybe the way we are doing it. And those are pretty straightforward for most military leaders. I think most military leaders would give you an answer that's pretty similar to that. It's always in the nuances of how the organization's being run. I describe in the book a case where an officer's promotion to brigadier general is delayed because of a Senate staffer, and the military supports the officer, pushing his confirmation, then gives up and just decides not to. And the officer retires, even though I knew the officer, I knew the situation, and I thought him being stopped was unfair. Then the question is that a moral thing? Is that something where the senior leader of the United States Army ought to fall on his sword and resign because his recommendation about Officer X is not accepted? And it's easy to say, yes, as soon as something's being done that you think is wrong, you ought to lie down on the railroad tracks, but that's not practical. You've also got to protect the institution, so it becomes murky, and it becomes really hard. And you can find yourself as a senior leader starting to rationalize things, and you rationalize them bit by bit by bit until you have a situation that's unacceptable. If we go back to what happened to the Wehrmacht, the German military in the 1930s, when Adolf Hitler was elected. Remember, Adolf Hitler was elected to power, and then he gathered power very, very rapidly. And he started at the beginning to give the military what they wanted, bigger budgets. And so they thought, well, this is good. They didn't respect him. He was a former corporal from the First World War. They didn't respect him individually, but he was powerful, and he was doing things they liked. 1936, they changed the oath of the Wehrmacht from an oath to the state to an oath to the leader, Adolf Hitler. Okay, you're starting a slide where people are starting to personalize loyalty, to do things that they know were wrong. And it happened at various places. Some of the military were able to say, well, I was just serving, I was following orders. But in many cases, a lot of things were done by military that they knew were dead wrong. There was no doubt about it, murder squads and whatnot. And so I think that's the product of this rationalization. You erode. You don't suddenly jump over and say, I'm going to do a bunch of bad things. But you find yourself down the road and you go, wait a minute, we're at a place where we shouldn't be. We are not upholding values and levels of character that we thought we were. And I think a lot of leaders are tortured by some version of that.
Well, this isn't a political show, but when you mention that, it does make me nervous and anxious to see some of the things happening in this country, because a lot of these issues, they're slippery slope issues. And it can start small and it cascades over time. And anyway, we could have a whole show about that, and I won't go there. So when you're in that position of authority in the military, you obviously are privy to information. You don't necessarily have 100%, but you have way more than someone typically would have. And of course, you've been removed from the military for some time now, a civilian. And you mentioned in the book about there being a dearth of critical thinking in society. Most of us aren't doing the hard work to understand issues, form our own opinions, but we're mostly, my words here, regurgitating what we hear from, I assume, influencers and media pundits and the like. So now that you're no longer privy to that kind of information you used to have, what do you do to try to free yourself from media bias and groupthink?
Yeah, it is hard, because you're right. You finish working out in the morning, you take a shower, you turn the TV on, you hear pundits describing something, and they're pretty smart people, and they say, logical things, and you say, well, that must be what it is. And then you live through some events in your life where you were involved, and you remember what the pundits were saying then, because they were imperfectly informed. And they may have been logical people, but often what they were saying was just dead wrong, because they didn't know. And so what I do now is every time I see an event or the assessment of it, I'm very skeptical, because those times when I was involved in things like that, they were invariably quite different than was assessed and described to people. And because in today's world, it's so easy to run a powerful influencing campaign. You just push. People will accept some version of what you say just because they're getting so much of it so repetitively. So the way I do it now is I try to read. I have a series of things that I go on the web for information. A couple of newspapers, a couple of magazines that I go to every day. And it's just, maybe I ought to be wider, but you got a certain amount of time. And so I go to those and I take those in. I also try to talk to friends of mine, not to get secrets or anything, but just to get, I'd say, boy, I'm seeing this and I'm not sure I understand it. And they'll go, oh, what you're seeing is ridiculous. I'll describe, for example, there were the demonstrations in Los Angeles a few weeks ago. And I am friends with two of the former Los Angeles County police chiefs. And I don't live in Los Angeles, but I talked to both of them. And I said, okay, I'm seeing on TV, what do you think? And both of them said, what you're seeing from both ends of the political spectrum is absolutely misleading. the demonstrations are of a different scale and location than it then appears on TV. The nature of it is this. And they said both sides we're trying to influence are presenting a very skewed picture. But I happen to know those two gentlemen. I happen to be able to ask people with on-the-ground presence and ability, maturity to provide that. So I try to find that. When I can't get that, I guess I just remain skeptical. If something occurs over there and I'll go, well, that may be the case, but wow, I'm just going to withhold my opinion, because too often I found that later I realized I only had incomplete information.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I don't know the last time we used our military in a domestic situation. So I've got thoughts on that, but again, I'm trying to. It'll quickly evolve into political territory here. I want to shift gears, talk about culture for a bit, and then leadership. You mentioned either this one or another book, financial incentives needed to attract and retain talent, and you've got a somewhat provocative perspective that less talented employees working within a healthy culture produce better outcomes than a bunch of overpaid superstars. And maybe this is analogous to the earlier conversation we had about the Rangers, but of course, as special forces troops, so different from the corporate world. But now that you've been consulting around leadership and culture in the corporate world, you've got a very different, maybe more broadened perspective. There's this old saying, I'm sure you've heard it, that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I guess it eats talent as well. But we'd love to hear more about how this notion of a healthy culture drives outsized performance, and maybe what does a healthy culture mean? What's your definition of that?
Yeah, I do sign up for the fact that culture is much more powerful than strategy. It always will be. In fact, I think most organizations can form their strategy on a Saturday morning in 2 or 3 hours, but implementing that strategy with the right culture is really hard. And that's the differentiator. I think when I think about culture, you could say culture is what people do. And that seems way too simplistic. But in reality, cultures evolve. Having served around the world, what you find in places, you go somewhere and the way they interact seems strange. Like in Afghanistan, in the Pashtun areas, there's a cultural set of norms called Pashtunwali. And there's a series of sort of rules under that. And one of the rules is if you kill someone from another tribe, you pay restitution. You like a financial amount. They have a meeting, they have a jirga, they come together and they negotiate this out and they pay. And then everybody says, all right. And it seems pretty cold-blooded, but on the other hand, what they've learned is long-running feuds are so damaging that they had to find a way to stop them. And so they came up with this over generations, a mechanism kind of like a lawsuit that says, okay, and that ends it right here. Because they found if they didn't end it, it was terrible. So culture are adaptations to the environment around you and to other factors. And so there's a reason that people do things they do. When you go into an area and you look at things that are very, very different, it's easy to be judgmental about them. And you say, why in the world don't they do this, or why do they do that? There's usually a rational reason behind it. Most people are rational, and if you go back why they do something, and you may not agree with it, maybe the rational is built in religious beliefs that sometimes will push things in a certain direction, but they tend to make sense once you understand them fully, and that's why respecting cultures is important. In organizations, cultures really define the experience. If you work in a place that is dog eat dog, backstabbing competition and whatnot, you may make a lot of money, you may be successful individually, but it's likely not to be a very pleasant experience. It's likely to be stressful. It's likely to be dispiriting in many ways because you can't trust, because everybody's got this individual incentive to perform better than you. And so my belief is that if you can shape a culture that has very high expectations of people, and people accept that, and therefore they have very high expectations of themselves, then you're partway there. Now, the key thing about this is, my experience is, you have to be able to tie it to something. In the military, it was easy. You could wrap it into the flag, you could wrap it into the mission of the organization, which were accepted as important things. In a civilian company, where you struggle is, you say, okay, we make bagels to have a better world. And people go, oh, wait a minute, you know.
Well, I mean, a good bagel, in all fairness.
That's true.
Doesn't hurt.
But the point is, when you suddenly say, we're going to make the world a better place by doing X, and there are things that do that, but most of them are on the edges. You know, most things. And so I think you've got to identify to people, okay, what is the purpose of what we're doing? Why are we willing to team up? Why are we willing to sacrifice? Sometimes it's just to be part of a very good team that does something that's generally good, and the joy of being part of that team gives you a sense of belonging. It can give you a shared sense of taking care of each other. You feel like you are contributing to something. You feel like you are also getting protected because you're part of a herd or a tribe. You're not alone. So sometimes those things are the most important part of it. They're more important than the actual product the organization produces. That's actually a vehicle, in my view, as a reason to get people together, to do stuff together, to take care of each other, you know, to teach and all those kinds of things. So I think that's the key thing. And you mentioned, I wrote about incentives. The problem with incentives is we go back to this idea that everybody does stuff for money. I mean, that's sort of the premise. And if you come up with these very complicated incentives packages that touch all the right motivations in that person, then you will get them to perform the very best they can, because they will get the very largest amount of money out of it. And most studies have proven that that's not really true, and that it does apply to people almost on a assembly line level. If you say you do 80 widgets an hour instead of 60, we're going to pay you more. They actually studies do show an incremental improvement. But when you get up into some of the corporate things, I think we've tied ourselves into a Gordian knot, and we've made them so complicated we don't understand them. And yet, because everybody does it, everybody thinks your organization has to do it to stay with your competitors. And there's some truth to that.
It's interesting because I'm reading this and I'm thinking, okay, if culture is that strong, and that drives organizational performance, then almost one could just sort of swap in whoever at the top rung of the ladder, and it wouldn't make a difference. And you mentioned, I think it was your memoir, how good leadership actually makes a huge difference. And that, I think, the analogy you were giving is if you, I don't know if this was an actual experiment they did or if this is your hypothesizing, but that if they swapped battalion commanders, the best and the worst ones, that the standings of those battalions would actually reverse, like practically overnight. So clearly there's something there that makes a huge impact. So would love to understand, what is it about a leader in a top performing unit that separates that individual in terms of their specific role as a leader from everyone else? Because it sounds like that one person is is incredibly influential in driving outsized performance.
That's correct in my experience, and it's always correct. But it's because the leader affects the culture. Very rarely is the difference that the leader is so smart in military strategy or business that it is their operational decisions that make the big difference. You could make an argument that Napoleon Bonaparte was as good a military tactician and also strategist as has lived. But I would argue his strongest differentiation was the culture he created in the Grande Armée. He created this culture where French soldiers, after the French Revolution, came to the flag and they felt this incredible pride. He used things like medals, and he said, people will do anything for a piece of ribbon, soldiers, to be recognized. He put this pride in units. And it was those things we don't talk as much about. We tend to say, well, you know, he attacked on the left, he attacked on the right. He built a culture that really, for more than a decade, he ran that army just hard in war after war after war, and they stayed with him all the way to the very end. In fact, arguably, after it should have ended. And so I think leaders shape the culture. And now sometimes one of the things they bring is this sense of confidence, because if you're working for someone that you think is really good at business decisions, if you're working for a Steve Jobs and you think he can create amazing products or something, then that's something. But actually what Steve Jobs created was a culture in Apple that created teams with expectations and standards that created amazing stuff. He didn't create anything. He set standards and expectations and pushed the organization to do things that they would not have done otherwise. And so that's where I found the biggest difference in leaders is. And I don't know of a study that they've actually experimented by switching, but I am 100% confident. And it would be just a stark shift.
Well, Steve Jobs, and I actually know people that work for Steve Jobs, not an easy person to work for at all. Obviously a brilliant entrepreneur, but it's interesting you bring him up because he was certainly not lacking charisma. And if you think of tech, and I don't know how much of your work crosses over into tech companies, but just, you know, founders in general tend to have a charismatic personality, what have you. But you mentioned, again, going back to the military, and then you can maybe connect dots for me, you know, to the corporate world. But that sometimes the military leaders with a lot of charisma wouldn't live up to their potential. Correct me if I'm misstating. That was my sense, and so that, which is not shocking, but maybe a little bit surprising how much we tend to value charisma. We tend to idolize charismatic leaders in our society. So would love to hear about why perhaps some of them you saw in your experience, both military and corporate as a consultant, why and what ways they fail, and then what's needed for someone that is lacking that charisma to maybe to overcome that deficit, if you will, to be very effective without it. It's sort of a two-part question.
Sure, yeah. I'll take it on first the way I think of charisma in kind of two ways.
Okay.
There is a charisma of the very attractive person that just looks good, and usually they speak eloquently, they've got a polish, and whenever I'm around those people I feel kind of awkward and stupid. But you look at them and you are a bit mesmerized by them. And in the military sense, there are many leaders who have that, and they can kind of move through. But over time, what happens is, for most of them, particularly if you go to actual war and in combat, there is a test that says, can they actually deliver? Because charisma on the battlefield is different. Charisma on the battlefield is showing your commitment. Charisma on the battlefield is showing your courage. It's showing your competence. It's showing your perseverance in some cases. And so suddenly, soldiers don't care if you're 6'2" with straight teeth and, good posture. What they care is, are you that kind of person that they think, holy smoke, this person really is good at what they do, cares about the soldiers. And so it's a different kind of charisma. When I think of Elon Musk sleeping on factory floors when he's trying to push a certain process through, there's a charisma to that. Holy smoke, because we're attracted to that. Holy smoke, here's a person who's so all in, we're going to do that. And so I think that there's a superficial charisma, which is almost like a coat of paint, and it's not really real. But then there's that charisma of somebody who is magnetic because of the combination of factors I just talked about. And I think it's pretty similar in business and in the military from that standpoint, because there are a lot of business leaders I think could go out and be wonderful military leaders right away. I mean, literally in a week. But we sometimes, you watch on a TV news channel and you see a CEO of a company and they're just so polished and they're so impressive and their numbers are terrible. And you go, well, maybe they're too polished. Maybe they're too mile wide and an inch deep.
Yeah. I'm a leadership advisor by day. I do a lot of interviews, placing a lot of executives, and you have what I call a lot of false positives for this. People that they interview really well. They show up well, they're articulate, they're polished, they have all the right answers. And then meanwhile, they rub everyone the wrong way in an organization. They don't know how to pull people along. They don't know how to find alignment. They don't know how to empower teams, motivate teams. They're smart as a whip. Smart, articulate, strategic, but just miserable. And so it's always one of those things where I try to figure out how does one, in an interview setting, find ways to just really pressure test that. It's easier said than done. You also mentioned that there's this fine line between self-confidence and humility. And a good leader has to find the balance between these two. And I've seen this. I've experienced it as a leader myself. I've seen it with others. And, on the one hand, you want to convey confidence and conviction to your teams. But let's say there's a challenging situation. You want to be authentic and not necessarily give false hope either. But yet, your troops, your teams, your organization is looking to you, and your wherewithal, your leaning is very much going to dictate how they should feel about a situation. I'd love to hear more about that balance and how to figure out the right balance.
Yeah. It is art because it's a little different in every situation, but you're right. I'm a believer that on a personal level, that humility is critical, and you've got to maintain it in yourself. It's got to be genuine, and it's got to be projected to people, not as this always, self-deprecating mode where, I'm just no good, etc. That's not what you're trying to say. You're just saying, I'm a person, I got strengths and weaknesses, I'm going to do my best, but understand I'm just a person here, and I'm going to contribute to this effort. Now, the confidence part, I think, can come into that says, now here's what you can be confident in. I will never leave you. I will not quit. Whatever kinds of commitment you're willing to make to an organization, if you're willing to never lie to them, you can tell them that. If you're willing to be committed to the bitter end till you get fired or the company fails, you can tell them that, but only if you're willing to do it. I think you can also talk about the organization and say you can have confidence because we are cumulatively better than any single person. We are cumulatively something that we can have great confidence in, and you can point that out. Everybody expects you to do a little bit of cheerleading for it to be a little better. You want to accentuate the positive. They've got to understand that you are not denying the negative. But you're saying there are challenges, there are issues, but here are the good things that can focus on and we are going to leverage to make as good as possible. There's, a funny dynamic when you become a senior leader, and I think the same's true in a military leader, same's true in a corporation. You're expected to believe in the mission. You're expected to go as hard as you can. And so as a senior leader, you're pulled back to testify in front of Congress, and you've signed a statement that says, I will always tell you my personal views, not the views of the administration. You actually have to give that promise when you're promoted to 3-star. And you go in front of them, and if they ask a question like, can we win in Afghanistan? And you say, well, if in your heart you think it's a long shot, but if you get in front of them and go, well, I think we got about a 30% chance, then you go back to your troops and they're out there risking their lives, and they go, boss, you just said I'm risking my life for a 30% chance? What's up with that? And so that there is a paradox that you've got to show a level of confidence. We can take this hill, because as soon as we think we can't, we won't. It is absolutely self-limiting. And so there has to be a certain amount of, okay, follow me, we're going to do this, even though it's going to be harder. It may be a low probability.
You could say, Stan, you could say we're going to take this hill, and I think collectively we're going to be victorious, but if I'm handicapping it, I think we may potentially, a third of you may not be going home.
Yeah.
So, right. They're not mutually exclusive. It could be both. I'm confident that this will be a successful mission, but I'm also confident that we're going to lose a lot of lives in the process. And here's why it's worth it. I assume there must have been some of those situations that you encountered. Yeah,
there are. I would tell you that usually you don't say 35% of you all are going to make it. Usually what you do, you use euphemisms. You say this is going to be a very difficult operation, and it's not going to be without cost. But this is why it's important, and this is why we will succeed. And you build up their belief in why it's important and their confidence that the plan is as good a plan as you could come up with.
You spent how much time in the military? Like 3 decades, 4 decades?
A little over 34 years after West Point.
And you mentioned how over the course of those 34 years, as you got into leadership and then different levels of leadership, that your style would fluctuate over time between a hard-driving taskmaster and a more nurturing father figure. Eventually, I think you came to realize that consistency was vitally important. And then over time, those swings would get less pronounced. Would love to hear about that journey a little bit. And then, given the importance of consistency, what does that mean for you in terms of where you ended up, as far as where you were on that spectrum, and how you advise if you were not just military leaders but corporate leaders in terms of how they should operate? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In my case, and I think I'm not uncommon, you are trained to be a leader. You're exposed to the stories and in some cases in-person performance of other leaders. So you have examples to go from, and you start to try to say, okay, what is my leadership style going to be? And early in my career, I found myself with, as you described, these significant swings. One period I'd be sort of a martinet, very demanding, that sort of thing. And the other I'd be more understanding and informal. And it would change because I would experiment with one. It's almost like trying to figure out what works, what's good for me. And you'll
you read about somebody and they were a certain way and you go, well, I'll be that way. I'll be Ulysses Grant, or I'll be so-and-so. And the first lesson you learned is you can't be anybody else. My father described in his career, he got to Korea or Germany right after World War II. And there were a bunch of American generals running around that were little George Patton imitators. And they would do many of the things Patton did. But as he said, nobody could be Patton because that was Patton. And it was natural for him and it worked for him. It didn't work for anybody else. They seemed like fools. And so you experience these things and you have to figure out what's really you. And so I found that my swings started getting less and less as I had more experience because I started realizing more of who I am. I started realizing that certain things were good in the short term. Like if you go scream at your troops, it's effective in the short term because they will all scurry around. The second or third time, they scurry a little bit less. And then after a while, they stop scurrying because you scream a lot. And you realize it ultimately doesn't work. So you realize, okay, I'm not going to do that because that doesn't work. And it doesn't feel good. And so what I found in my journey is I got more and more a believer that what my job was to make the people that I worked with as confident and as effective as I could. Create a culture that demanded a lot of them. And so they understood that we were going to perform at the best level we could, but then not have them live in fear, not have them wonder whether I'm going to scream at them on Monday and pat them on the back on Tuesday, try to be as consistent as possible, but always pushing because I found, for my particular style, if you were too laid back, I use that term, you know, people like you and they want to do stuff, but there may not be the urgency that you need. The leader does have to lead or push, and sometimes it's a combination of the two, the organization moving forward. It's very easy for an organization to dog paddle in circles, and somebody's got to be providing that overall pressure to move forward.
So speaking of moving forward, you've got a chapter in this book, I think it's called Ditching the Rearview Mirror. And it's essentially about looking ahead and not dwelling in the past. So that 3.5 decade military service came to this abrupt end in 2010. I don't want to rehash it. There was an article that came out, supposed comments were made about the administration, yada, yada, yada. People can look it up. But this is at the time, your life, your career, your life. I think you said, how old were you? 3 years old, 4 years old, when you knew what you wanted to do, which is very rare. So this notion of just looking ahead, were you able to do that here? Because I imagine it was a lot of emotions to work through at the time. Yeah,
and thanks for raising it. In 2010, when I resigned from the Army after the magazine article came out, you know, in an instant, everything changed because I had been a soldier since I went to West Point at age 17, and I'd been a military child before that, so everything about me identified with being a soldier. And suddenly that is gone. And I'm not a commander, I'm not a general, I'm not any of that stuff. And all of my performance in that previous career are called into question by, you know, the manner of me leaving the service. You know, I was a publicly disgraced general for a period. You know, news cycles don't last long, but the reality was, in my mind, it lasted a lot longer. So in some ways, I was fortunate. Now, I'm not glad it happened, but in some ways, it was the best thing that could have happened to me because I was 55, about to be 56, and it was like having a Band-Aid ripped off. You know, I was going to leave the service. I was going to retire. I was planning to retire 2 more years later, but instead the Band-Aid's ripped off. And I can't be a soldier anymore, so I have to look forward. Now, there is a potential just to be a bitter old general and just, you know, sort of marinate in my bitterness for the rest of my life. And I didn't see any point in that. My wife was really good in helping me. So and this is what I tell people leaving the service now, you can take great pride in what you are, but the day you retire, you are not that anymore. You know, you asked if you should call me General McChrystal. I mean, on one level, yeah, but I'm not a general anymore. I was a general. And it's important to me because I have to be something, whatever I choose to be. I am now free to be what I choose to be if I'm willing to let go of the past. And again, I can have pride in the past. It's not denial. But I can't be a soldier anymore, so what do I want to be? And so I think that frees you up to go be whatever it is you want. If you want to teach, if you want to be a banker, whatever it is, whatever skill you're willing to try to master and be a part of, you can be. And I think that's true of a lot of our lives. Mine was sort of a dramatic forcing function, but I think that we have got to be willing to set everything down at one point when we're going a new direction and completely go in that new direction. And you can't completely forget everything before, particularly if there's any hurt feelings or negative baggage, but you can minimize it. You can pay as little attention to it as possible. And I think that works well.
I mean, I'm with you 150%. Still easier said than done. So it sounds like your wife maybe was helpful. Were there others, whether it's therapists or friends or anyone that helped you? I mean, maybe you had the philosophy, but actually adopting it and implementing is very different from just the notion. Of course, we all know that would be healthy to just move on, but it just happened so quickly, and again, so much of your identity was wrapped up in that life. How anyone that was instrumental in helping you work through that?
I'll describe several. First and foremost with my wife, Annie, because what she did from the second I told her is she said, okay, we are not going to sit here and feel sorry for ourselves. We've always been happy. We're going to be happy. Okay, we're just going to go find out what makes us happy going forward. And if my wife had been the kind of person who was always whispering in my ear going, you got screwed, you got a bad deal, that would sort of pull you back into the past. But she never talks about it. And never did. We just boom. Then there were other people friends of mine who I had served with for years, and they'd committed much of their lives working with me. And they came to my retirement ceremony. They stayed connected. They didn't stay distant or ostracize me. And that was important because the first thing is I went into sort of a cocoon because I didn't know who wanted to talk to me anymore because I was damaged goods. They reached out, and they didn't wallow in it either. They just go, okay, you're not damaged goods. Let's see what you can do. And then there were some people who I'd never known before. There was a CEO of a company, he was at JetBlue Airlines, and he asked me to join his board of directors. Now, he watched the news, but he asked me to join his board of directors. That's something completely different. And these were people who were validating me as a person. And that was very important in the moment because it rebuilds your confidence. Because mine, for a period of time, was pretty badly dented. And as people start to renew their faith in you or to show faith if they hadn't known you before, it's really effective.
I don't know if you still teach at Yale. Do you still teach at Yale?
I gave it up about 2 years ago after 12 years, but I do still work with a football team. I do leadership training with a football team every year. I love that.
So I don't know if you do this with the football team, but at least with the Yale students when you were teaching at the university, that you would have them write their own obituaries. Could you share what yours would say?
No one ever did it to me. I hope mine would say that I was a successful soldier. It would necessarily have to say that my career ended suddenly, with the publication of a news story. But I would hope that it would then say that after that, I built a business. I taught at Yale. I wrote 5 books. I created a culture around that business that produced people that have gone off. I hope that it would also say that I supported some things that were important. I supported national service, and I've done that for a decade. I'm supporting the democracy. There are a number of movements now to just renew and support American democracy. I hope it would say that what I did was I contributed. I was of value. I wasn't a big political leader. I wasn't a big business leader, but I was of value. And I didn't just stack arms when I left the military and fade away. I actually continued to contribute until I was 150.
God willing, we started the interview early on. You're sharing how behind writing the book, as you've gotten older, you've evolved.
Yeah.
Your notion of character has evolved, etc. So, do you think the obituary that you just laid out, has that evolved as well? Do you think how you think about what you'd want that to say today would be different from how you might have thought about it 15, 20 years ago?
Sure. I think 15 or 20 years ago, I would have been much more focused on what rank I achieved, what military success I had. I don't think I would have been nearly as focused. Now, maybe I'm focusing on those other things now because I know that necessarily there'll be that mention of the end of my military career, not the way I wanted it to be. So maybe it's a defense mechanism, but I also think it's just understanding what really matters. I think back now that the senior military leaders I knew, sergeants, majors, and generals, they fall in different categories in terms of within the force, how they're viewed. There are some people who were very successful that very few people like or ever liked. And then there are other people who may not have been quite as successful, but they were deeply respected and beloved. And when I step back now, the history books don't really capture that. It's tribal knowledge inside the military tribe. But that part is more important to me. I would like to be one of the people that when people are getting together and having a beer, they go, Stan was a good soldier. And that's more real to me than, the other accomplishments.
Yeah. We'll wrap with this question. It's how I end every interview. The podcast, Ron, is the art of excellence. And I love to try to get a sense for how my guests view that word excellence. So when you think of the word, what does it mean to you?
Yeah. It means doing something as well as you are capable of doing it, which means whatever you do, you've identified or learned through experience, I can do this that well. And if I make that the standard and I adhere to that, that's excellence to me. Now, our various levels can differ by people, for sure, but it is our particular capability matched with our effort.
I'll take it. That's a good one. This book, again, is on character, the choices that define us. And I'll have in the show notes the other books you've written. They're all fantastic. This is one where I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you, but it's one of these, like, if you mentioned philosophy, like meditations and books like that, they just feel like they're evergreen. I could put this down now and 5 years from now, come back and read it and pick up a lot of things just to make me reflect. Because you did a very nice job of, again, while you were good at weaving in some stories, it wasn't about you. It wasn't a memoir. It was just reflections on character and what it means and how to think about it. And it wasn't trying to in any way push any kind of dogma as much as just have us reflect and help us shape our own thinking about what it means. So I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed this interview. You don't have to do this. I'm very, very grateful that you did. Stan, you've had an incredible career, an incredible life. I hope that's not the last book. And thank you. Thank you for taking the time and being on the show.
Well, Glenn, I'm very grateful for you having me on today. And I very much enjoyed the conversation as well.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.